Hey, everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today we are honored to have back on our good friend, Daniel Ingram, who's an MD, medical doctor. He's the author of Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. And I want to say you played a major role in the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, which is, in my opinion, pioneering work. And for people listening, I hope they pick up on that, how I think important it is in the UAP field, but also in consciousness and for what Daniel does, medical, right? So welcome back on, Daniel.
It's great to be here. Thank you, James. Great to see you and chat out as always.
Likewise. And just for people who might be hearing about you for the first time, um, can you just give a very brief breakdown of the book Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha?
So this is a book I started writing as little pamphlets and essays and stuff in the late 90s as I was having all these meditative experiences and starting to digest mostly Buddhist, but some other forms of map theory and concepts. And it eventually evolved into this book that was available online since the late 90s. People would print it out on their office copiers or whatever. And then eventually it got published in 2008 by, thank you, Eon Books for publishing it. And then there was a second edition, like, more fancy print edition with like a hardbound and expanded stuff and all that in 2017 or 18, something like that. And it's maps, it's theory, it's technical, it's social rants, it's an exhortation to do things well, but it also talks about the deep end. It talks about unusual experiences. It talks about entities and energies and powers and stuff that a lot of meditation books don't talk about. It's something of a weird cult classic. It's famous, infamous. It's its own strange little thing. I'm very grateful to all the people who helped it come into being, including all the people who figured the stuff out, the teachers who taught me, the friends who helped me on the path. There's really a lot of other people in that work. So thanks be to all of them.
Yeah, and for anybody interested in meditation, Dharma, whether it's Buddhist stuff or even way beyond that, I think the book goes very deep into that stuff, and it can be a very practical guide for people. So I'm going to include a link in the description for that.
And you
And
can find it at mctb.org for free.
yes, sir. And it's going to be linked in the description so people can access it easily. And again, just a quick rundown of the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium.
Yeah, so about 5 years ago, my friend Dr. Julieta Galante invited me to spend the summer at Cambridge University to help with a project that her and Andrea Grabovac and some other people were already working on, which is basically how do you help the clinical mainstream relate better to traditional maps of practice and the experiences that can result from meditation practice. Also ended up psychedelic, spontaneous experiences, and other related phenomena. And before we knew it, we were a 20 strong group. And then I was the retired guy with some resources and time and ended up sort of the de facto administrator organizer of this thing. And now we're over 270 people with representation from the world's top universities: Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, Yale, MIT, Brown, Stanford, Berkeley, Vanderbilt, et cetera, and lots of other great universities that just don't have quite such fancy names, too many to list. And our goal is to upgrade, do the decades of work it takes to help the clinical mainstream, psychiatry, emergency medicine, neurology, general practice, psychology, et cetera, relate vastly better to the world of what we call spiritual, mystical, magical, psychedelic, energetic phenomena. And that includes things like UAP phenomena, encounters, entities, all that kind of stuff, and the fascinating effects that can happen after these sorts of experiences. And to help the clinical mainstream have vastly better data, better diagnostic criteria, management strategies, cultivation strategies for the positive stuff, how to take some advantage of some of the opportunities that are inherent in these things for a better life, for a better mind, mental health, body, etc. And to do all the science and lobbying and policy stuff and everything that we need to do that. So now I help run this project in the charity Emergence Benefactors, which you can find at ebenefactors.org, that helps to support the EPRC and its allies, which include all kinds of organizations like IONS, et cetera.
Yeah, and in light of that, one of the themes I wanted to discuss today was, spiritual emergency. And although you can hear a term like that and maybe imply a lot of things. Daniel, how would you define spiritual emergency first off?
Wow. So trying to put bounds on this thing is a little bit complicated because the range of effects that can occur is so incredibly broad. So really, this should be its own medical subspecialty or even specialty. There's enough complexity there. So I'm going to give something that is meant to be expansive, not limiting in the way I define it. So um, the there are so many different categories effects that this can cause: physical, psychological, social, vocational, perceptual, existential. Um, the list goes on and on. We've got about 60 something categories of major types of effects here, and linguistic, etc., can change the way people speak, the way people remember things, the way people relate to reality, can even cause strange physiological changes. And so this incredibly broad category, but to bring that down, we're sort of talking about the way I generally talk about this is the highs that get too high, the lows that get too low, the weirds that get too weird. And we can talk about that word too, what that means, too weird. And things that happen that might have been fine, but they don't fit in somebody's sociocultural context, or things that they might consider acceptable for their lives, or what's supposed to be okay in their tradition, or the way they were brought up, or the situation in which they find themselves, such as a medical context, a family context, a religious context, a cultural context, a materialist context, an academic context, a professional context, right? That whatever is happening to them doesn't fit the script, doesn't fit within the bounds of what seems to be okay, even if what's happening might not necessarily be that bad. There are people who can, start seeing beautiful colors where they shouldn't be seeing them, and they're off to the ER. And other people are just like, oh, that's kind of cool, right? And the problem is the clinical mainstream, my colleagues in medicine and psychiatry and psychology and all of that went into this to be to know things and help people. Unfortunately, when it comes to this domain, really do not. The textbooks are woefully lacking of emergency medicine, psychiatry, psychology, what's in the DSM-5 TR, which is the book we use to diagnose mental illness in most of the world. Even the equivalents like the Chinese CCMD-3 and the Latin American equivalents and some of the sort of hybrid European systems, et cetera. And then Africa and the Middle East are totally their own thing, very hard to really get a solid grasp of what is even happening in these continents, because it's very socioculturally complicated and kind of varies even by region and area, depending on where you are. South Latin America is also very complicated. Brazil has its own spiritist culture, which is very much its own sort of thing in some ways. And so even what might be considered an emergency varies by context, by culture. And somebody on a Kundalini yoga retreat who starts having energy and bliss pouring up their spine, that might be exactly what they were going for. And if the same thing happened to while you're a lawyer who's never had anything like this is sitting there in court, and suddenly they start having that same experience, can be related to extraordinarily differently. So emergence and emergency, the difference is often contextual, right? The same phenomenology might be taken incredibly differently depending on where you are, and also depending on people's concepts, their coping skills, their tolerance for things like pain or even pleasure, their relationship to things like, is reality just a very normal, muggly sort of materialistic thing like we think about in a very kind of workaday way, or is reality multidimensional, multi-energetic? Are there different layers of our bodies? Do we have access to different dimensions? There are some people who are totally fine with all of those things, and when they start happening to them or experience them, they're not considered weird. Or someone takes a psychedelic and has an experience that if they had it without the psychedelic, it might totally freak them out, but they might be fine having it on a psychedelic because they have sort of an explanation of why they're having that particular experience, even though people can have extraordinarily psychedelic seeming phenomena on meditation or just sort of spontaneously. And so defining what spiritual emergency is, or sometimes it can be very physical, weird twitching movements or shaking or trembling of limbs, or feeling suddenly extremely hot or very cold, or other weird tingling phenomena. For some people, that's just, oh, that's kind of cool. And for other people, that's like an emergency and they're getting their thyroid checked and off to the doctor and getting CAT scans and MRIs of their brain. And, occasionally they find things. It's not like there aren't medical conditions that can do that kind of stuff. There are. but there's also what you might call energetic phenomena, for example, that can do that. So defining spiritual emergency is complicated, but that just gives you like kind of an overview of the to help define how much of a problem even defining it is.
Yeah, and for people that are like, super into UFOs and UAP, I'm going to remind you that in Jacques Vallée's book, The Invisible College, there's an individual who he named Dr. X, who's an anonymous French doctor who had, pretty amazing UFO encounter where, the UFO ended up projecting a beam and it made a mark on his chest and what have you. But more extraordinarily was that the gentleman began having, again, what you might call like a spiritual transformation, that was instigated by a UFO event. So that, just a note there that,
And that's
that,
extremely commonly reported and even predicted in some of the maps. So if you look at the maps of some, meditative progression that you might find in these books, like, this commentary on the Abhidhamma or some of the old Pali commentaries, Visuddhimagga and Vimudimagga, you find all kinds of descriptions of entities and encounters with entities that these people are, it seems, perceiving as very real. And they're having very real effects on them sometimes. So the spiritual literature before the modern era, where these got sort of an alien, 1940s to 50s.
yeah,
I really started in the late 1800s, right, with the idea of people going to the moon and encountering strange
yeah,
things and all that, right? So, but before it got that kind of cultural overlay, encounters or entities were not, generally described in terms of extraplanetary, although sometimes there was this notion of the music of the spheres and
yes, yeah.
angels coming down from up above. And so there's a long history of this that just in our own current cultural context often has this overlay of materials and metals and strange alloys and radiation and electronic
Yeah.
effects and shutting down nuclear weapons
And
facilities and radar stuff and tracings and all that. Okay, cool. And just recognize this is part of a much longer conversation that if you look at the spiritual literature, the mystical literature, is very old. And so
yeah,
I think of it in this much broader historical context. And to me, it all looks like a continuation of that same phenomenon.
yeah, and as Dr. Diana Pasulka noted,
Mm-hmm.
one of the reasons she got into the research is because she was studying um, Catholic,
American Cosmic. Yeah.
yeah, Catholic literature too. She was finding anomalous phenomena where, in one instance, a nun was being visited by an orb or a ball of light. Yeah, there you go.
You might check
And
out this book, Good Times.
yeah, and and so these kind of encounters, it didn't have the extraterrestrial or alien lens, yet it was an anomalous experience that if you didn't know otherwise, they'd be taught. It sounds like they're talking about UAP, the UFO phenomenon, and
Mm-hmm.
entity encounters, as you said.
And
But
even the chariots and machines and kind of complicated objects that are sometimes described in the sky or that riding on that might have fire coming out of them or might, be spherical or disc
and
shaped. I mean, there you go back in art and literature, there's lots of this.
yeah,
So it's
and I
again not
had
new.
I had one of those like fireball type encounters as well in broad daylight. So and again, you look in this ancient again, spiritual literature. What else? I mean, I'm putting spiritual in quotes because that's just a word we're using to describe a particular realm of thought and thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And my mom was at a Goenka center on a meditation retreat and had gotten to territory they would call Banga in their tradition and way of mapping these things. This, sort of a big major opening phase. And, she had this whole alien encounter of a spaceship she could see through the roof of her structure to this thing and had this whole interaction. Anyway, so yeah, and so then there can be this overlap between the spiritual and the UAP world, particularly as you find like the cultivation techniques you find in CE5 technology, right? Where you're getting
right.
into meditative stuff and getting into this. And so obviously there's a staggering amount of overlap of these Venn diagrams.
And I actually wanted to get into kind of this, spiritual emergency, spiritual awakening, or awakening in general, and human potential. But before we go there, I did want to loop back and say, okay, for the idea of a spiritual emergency, are there particular symptoms? How does somebody know if they might be having a spiritual emergency?
Yeah, so that's also a critical question. And actually, the Expert Opinion Project, which we're launching, is designed to query the world's experts on how in the world do you differentiate these things? How do you know your sodium isn't low, or you don't have multiple sclerosis, or you aren't having a temporal lobe seizure versus you're having what I might, in my sort of Daniel 1, as I call him, meditator Daniel Hat,
Yeah.
call a Kundalini awakening or explosion or whatever, like, or, a conversion experience if you're in a Christian context, or being touched by the Spirit if you're in a particularly Pentecostal context, or something. Because, so obviously there's no hard and fast lines. And then in terms of, like, the whole bipolar psychosis thing, right? That's the next question that comes up. How do you know you're not just bipolar, manic, psychotic, becoming a schizophrenic or schizotypal or whatever? How do you know? And this is hotly debated. And then um, there's the question of function. So I very much and suffering. It's like kind of two lenses I view the mental illness question through. Like, are you functional in the face of whatever is happening with you? There are people who see garden gnomes, for example, in their gardens, and they follow their instructions and they grow beautiful vegetables and everything works out fine. They're not having any dysfunction. Or people, and like I mentioned this one a lot, Pentecostal context, for example, they speak in tongues, they hear the voice of the Spirit, and then they go to work and they're fine, right? So it's not causing interference with their life. And the Sigmund Freud's definition of mental illness is that which interferes with love and work. So if this stuff is interfering with your love and your work, like, then there's probably something you need to do about that. And there's all kinds of technologies, tricks, frameworks, people you can talk with, approaches, etc. So the first thing is, like, rather than looking at the phenomenon themselves, looking at the effects it's causing. If it's causing life enhancement, if you are better off, if you feel happy to have had an expanded paradigm or an experience or an encounter, and it's working for you, great, cool. Like, is that an emergency? I don't know. Like, it just sounds like a good time. If you were able to do like I was, when I had my first, explosion of my consciousness and traveling out of body and other weird stuff that happened to me as a kid, I just kind of shut up and kept my mouth shut and moved on with my life. And this weird stuff would happen sometimes, and I just compartmentalized it away. But I was, largely functional, I would say, kind of. I mean, there were effects that I could later tease out on retrospect when I knew the maps better. But at the time, I got decent enough grades and was okay, leader in my scout troop and things like that. It's like, all right, And so then there's people who, with relatively mild experiences, are freaked out badly by them. They're freaked out badly. They have an experience of telepathy, or they hear a voice or something, and like that is just not okay for them.
Yeah.
Right? And so this could be a real crisis for a person, of their crisis of belief, of how reality is, of how they are, of who they are, of how the world works, of what is true. The fundamental, like, it can shake people's faith if they have these strange experiences, or they can label them through a lot of fascinating lenses, either as psychosis or demons, or, who knows, just say, oh, it's a weird thing, whatever. And so you get into the question of sort of practical ontologies, the ontological frames that people choose of what is this? Like, that was an alien from the planet, whatever, or the whatever dimension.
Yeah.
That frame, for some reason, really works and is exciting and reassuring. And oh my God, we're not alone in the universe. This is fantastic. This is groundbreaking. I want to get all into this. And for other people, like, no, they're going to want meds to shut that stuff down, and the memories of it are going to haunt them, and they're going to be more comfortable, weirdly enough, with a diagnosis of psychosis than they are with maybe thinking there's other stuff out there in the world. Or maybe their doctors are, or maybe their family is. So the problem is, it's not just the person who sometimes in these situations starts making decisions, right? Or starts influencing the decision-making process of how we label things and what things are called, right? If someone ends up in an ER because they're having an experience that's too weird for them, and someone says, oh, this is psychosis, and thus you need an antipsychotic, that in and of itself, the whole aftermath that happens can become its own emergency. right? Because that can cause cognitive dysfunction, weight gain, metabolic problems, social stigma, loss of job, career, relationship. So sometimes the emergency is actually created not by the initial experiences themselves, but by hopefully well-meaning people then doing things that make the problem worse. Not that sometimes medications and stuff aren't useful and interesting and helpful and provide some utility. Sometimes they do for some people. But but the question of emergency. And then there's the question of like sort of the phenomenology itself. Okay, now that I've said all those qualifiers, so what are the things that tend to cause emergencies? Because I get a lot of calls about what's caused an emergency. The first, starting kind of down the chain, is weird physical stuff. People can't stop their arm from shaking. Their jaw and neck muscles have spasmed up in some weird way. They're feeling like something is stuck or tight, or they're like, so weird body stuff. Weirdly enough, some people might call spasmodic torticollis or wry neck or trigger points or whatever. Actually, to me, because you see this typically on day 2 or 3 of a meditation retreat, right before the energy stuff starts happening, to me, it looks like the prodrome of more interesting energetic things, right? So even then, because some of that can be really tight and painful and feel contracted and emotionally tough. Then if the energy starts to break loose, and then that's where, we get into these highs that get too highs for people's tolerance levels. They can stop sleeping, they can stop eating, they can see bright white lights, they can have explosions of consciousness, they can see entities, have fascinating encounters, go to other realms, feel like they went up into the light. Everything you've ever heard from an NDE, near-death experience, can happen in this phase when someone is not dead, not on a psychedelic, just on a meditation retreat, or just happen, quote unquote, spontaneously, meaning through causality we don't understand, or very light doses of meditation or some other practice. I know people in the military who were just like on a very intense watch, like late at night, trying to see if the enemy is there, and they got into such concentrated states of paying attention that all of a sudden they got into this, because it was in some ways extremely intensely contemplative with high degrees of concentration and energy, and sometimes sleep deprivation, that got them into what you might call a meditative or spiritual state. So, and then like a non-trivial portion of when people describe entity encounters or UAP encounters, I cannot help from a meditative mapping point of view to see some pretty heavy overlay with territory I would call the arising and passing away, based out of these books, and territory you can see described in places like A Path with Heart in chapters 9 and 10, where he talks about energetic chakral stuff and whatever, and the stuff happening. But you can see a tremendous amount of that, and that usually combines with some sort of, as has been pointed out, some kind of psychological something about the person. So the people who track back, what's the book where the guy does this, where he tracks back the psychological like underpinnings of a lot of these encounters and the way where they're described. Anyway, it is true that I can't remember the guy's name right now. It'll come to me.
Yeah.
But it'll often interact with their own issues, stuff, projections, ideals, frames, and take on an overlay of their culture, but not always. Sometimes like stuff totally outside of their culture. They've never thought about some Amazonian shaman, and all of a sudden they're having their experience. They've never thought really about the alien question at all, and suddenly they're seeing grays or Arcturans or whatever it is, right? So pick your favorite thing. And so, yeah, so doesn't always clearly reflect what's going on. And that can obviously really freak people, some people out. And then people can get high and stay high for days, weeks, months. I know people who barely slept for months, and they were writing their manifesto about the new consciousness revolution for the planet, and how we're all going to commune with the spirits or the aliens or whatever it was, like, and have the intergalactic, ambassador, and they're the new avatar of the new age. And so people can get really up, and that can get kind of off-putting and weird for a lot of people, obviously. Mimics the pattern seen in individuals who have founded whole religions that are still around thousands of years later. So, okay. And then there's the crashing people can get into, where dysfunction, from a mapping point of view, from a Buddhist mapping point of view, the stages are dissolution, fear, misery, disgust, desire for deliverance, and reobservation, which should be called like, instead of reobservation, because it's not a very good name. But people after their highs can get really dark, really afraid, really paranoid. They've seen something different, and their mind can come up with very complicated explanations of it. The way that they can relate to the emotional world can suddenly become super dark, cynical, angry, disappointed, full of grief or remorse, sadness, confusion, can bring up a lot of trauma stuff. So a lot of these things can play to deep things that have happened in people's pasts. Not also that strange for entity encounters to seem to play into some of those issues, particularly on the darker end. Demons, those kinds of experiences, creepy stuff. Um, yeah, and then what are the other things that people run into? And then there's like the dark side of energetic openings, where like zappings and buzzings and powerful feels like energy that can be extraordinarily dysphoric, whereas for most people it's very pleasant or just
Yeah.
really interesting. For some people it can be incredibly dysphoric, challenging, go on for a long time, confound neurologists, and get nerve conduction studies and MRIs of their whole spine and brain and all this stuff, and B12 and folate, and they find nothing. And and EEGs, and they still got nothing, and they're still having all this strange stuff. So the dark side of what you might call Kundalini energy can get really awful, and and often these things come as a package. So the problem is, if you have your first big opening, which often can involve entities and realms and traveling out of body and bright lights and even stigmata. If you look up the literature on stigmata, curious things that happen to your body, like the burn mark from the light,
Yeah.
that's a thing. There's a whole literature on this that will shock you if you start looking into it from a medical point of view. Really? Yep, really.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things that might fall into the category of spiritual emergency, either the thing that was induced or the things that was iatrogenic by something the healthcare system or a well-meaning family or society did to you in the face of you reporting these things or having these things. And it can cause major disruptions in relationships, in one's vocations, people quitting their school, quitting their jobs, wandering off on spiritual paths, feeling totally shattered, broken, confused, alienated, outside, alone. I think the loneliness and the lack of normalization, that this is something that happens to people and has been happening to people as far back as we know. There have been people, can be really damaging to people in and of itself. So people often do a lot better when they find some normalization, some maps, some other experiencers, some community, some connection, some validation, and tips and tricks for what has helped other people be functional in the face of these sorts of things. So that's kind of my big overview. I've been going on and on for a while. What are your thoughts?
Well, I was going to ask you a few questions in regards to, okay, like if you think you find yourself in a spiritual emergency, what could you do? You kind of got into it a little bit there.
Yeah. So if you think something like this might be happening to you, community is critical. So other
Yes.
people have had these kinds of experiences. Now, that doesn't mean community is always entirely helpful. Sometimes communities, even spiritual ones, can have weird overlay, blaming strange things, say yes, but they can do some wanting to fit into their orthodox frame, whatever it is,
Yeah.
giving these that only happens to people who have trauma or something. You must have. I was literally just talking to someone last week who, when they got into some of this stuff, weeks after having some plant medicine adventures, and then they started having all these things about entities in their body, and someone said, well, that could only possibly be happening to you if you had a sexual trauma history, and they didn't. Like, they're quite
Yeah.
sure they don't.
Yeah.
Like, and they did not find that helpful, right? So it's not like communities are always helpful. There can
Right.
be problems. People can take advantage of these situations, of their gullibility. I have a friend who was having experiences like this, and someone who wrote a major book about this stuff said, oh, give me all this money and I'll send you healing energy in your sleep.
Right.
Like,
And
and that was the whole thing. And it was like,
yeah, and if you find yourself in a situation like that, I mean, you tend to be vulnerable in a
Yep.
sense. Yeah, because you're in this territory where you don't know what's going on, so you're kind of, I mean, you could be seeking an authority
Mm-hmm.
or somebody who you feel knows what they're talking about. And again, like you said, just in the UFO community, it's there too, just like in the spiritual community, religious communities, human nature, right? There's
Yep.
groups out there that are maybe even well-meaning, but they turn into their own thing. So that's,
Yep.
definitely something you have to be aware of.
So, and particularly in the days and weeks after a major opening like this, yeah, people can be very, there's a cool article by Chris Timmerman that talks about how vulnerable people can be to reframing of
Yes.
their entire worldview of reality. So just be careful about firmly adopting any worldview if you've just had an opening like this until you've had
Yeah.
some kind of time to let the dust settle. Be wary of anything that costs money, or particularly a lot of money. Uh, um, it's good to be listened to. So finding people who can listen to the transpersonal world of psychology and psychiatry. So at the moment, they're the people who are the best set up to deal with this. Often, if you're looking for something in the semi-mainstream, even though like the mainstream has barely heard of transpersonal psychology and
Yeah.
psychiatry, they usually are licensed professionals that have this kind of expertise. So if you go looking for them, you can find them. There are spiritual emergency networks, like in the UK. There are groups such as Assist, IMHU, that help people with this, some of which have their own ontological frames and overlays. So just, again, some caution and care around that. Lots of cool books on this stuff. Luckily, these days, the internet has given a fascinating proliferation of information, not all of which is helpful, but some of which is. I particularly like the works of Tara Springett if you're having energetic stuff. Reading about UAPs and the phenomena and the various takes on it, because there are a lot of different ways to look at this. I think it's nice to have kind of a broad palette of perspectives on what this can look like. Obviously, watching podcasts like this one hopefully can help. Finding friends. There are communities out there that are non-exploitative, free online forums that aren't hopefully too toxic or coercive or culty.
Yeah.
Could be incredibly helpful. And if you find yourself with a partner who's not inclined to that kind of thing, at least being able to describe what's going on with you emotionally, like, hey, I'm feeling kind of raw and vulnerable today. Like, or hey, I'm having a hard time processing this. I'm sorry if I'm a little bit off. Like, just rather than going into all the details of your complicated theories about multidimensional planetary, whatever, like sometimes partners don't handle that as well. Even if you had said something much more simple, they might have handled that a lot better. Something that ordinary humans who may not have had that kind of experience can relate to. Yeah, ordinary is a funny word because actually lots of people have had these kinds of experiences. Lots of people have heard voices. Lots of people have seen spirits. If you look at the literature on like how many people have seen a ghost, it's like 25% of the population or something. How many people have heard a voice? It's actually a lot. How many people have had some kind of entity encounter, or what you might phrase as an entity encounter, or some aspect of the phenomena is actually weirdly large, though people often don't talk about it. Again, because the mental health world can be so extraordinarily punitive and monolithically not very nice about this stuff, even as well-meaning as it hopefully is.
Yeah, and that's people reporting it, because I forget, there was kind of like a poll or a study that said, you know, how many people had a UFO sighting or encounter, and some kind of poll where, and like a whole group of people had said yes, they had, and then they said how many people reported it, and it was like 1 out of 10
Yeah.
of who had the actual experience.
And that's what you find with energetic, meditative,
Yeah.
spiritual, psi, etc. stuff. How many people are going to tell their boss at work that they have telekinesis experiences or whatever? Like,
yeah,
I don't know. It kind of depends on where you work. If you're working at DOPS or IONS,
yeah.
maybe, but most other places, no.
So is there, I mean, how would you frame this? The difference or even similarities between a spiritual emergency and awakening or spiritual awakening?
Well, it's a great question. And the first is where you draw the line at awakening. And I can see lots of good reasons to draw it in different places. And different, the term awakening comes out generally of the sort of Sanskrit literature that comes out of India and related countries of Buddhism, Hinduism, Vedanta, right, as a concept, and then got sort of reincorporated back into the West through the work of people like Blavatsky and Theosophical Society and all of that, which is a fascinating way for anything to get incorporated into anything, because they were remarkably elaborate in their conceptions, and intricate, let's just say, in their inventiveness and synthesis. So the concept in the West in some ways is relatively new, but we have things that kind of look like it. If you look at the Christian mystical literature and some of the Greek mystical literature, philosophical mystery school, etc., some of the Sufi literature in Near East, and Kabbalistic literature, you find these reports. You can find concepts and that are sort of like that, So it kind of depends on what you mean awakening and where you functionally want to draw the line. I'm not gonna like there's sort of a hardcore Buddhist side of me that could overlay that with all kinds of frameworks. I don't think it's going to be particularly helpful for most people or in this context. So for a lot of people, they're awakening to them functionally, like the line in their life, the before and after, is going to be when they have that first big opening, right? Whatever you call it. I might call it the arising and passing away. You might call it
Right.
Kundalini opening, your first big encounter, your first big energetic, your conversion experience, your spirit, whatever, like your initiation, whatever it is, right? There's that first big line is like there's the before and the after in most people's lives, and they can
Yeah.
draw it that day, that moment.
Yeah.
It and so functionally that's an important line, regardless of whether or not you want to label it awakening, because in some ways they have awakened in the sense of to other possibilities, to different ways of looking at the universe, of experiencing their own heart, mind, body system, of experiencing things like space and time, energy, all of that. There's usually some pretty big shift that happens there. It certainly did for me.
Well, even like
Yeah.
as an example, somebody in the UFO community might be familiar with the founder of IONS, right? The Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, and he was
Yep.
very involved in UFO research, but just as, if not more importantly, consciousness research.
Mm-hmm.
And he had the overview effect
Yep.
when he was looking at the Earth, and he described it as a type of samadhi.
Yeah. So it can involve very intense sense of concentration of things happening to you, spontaneously arising, a very, very powerful sense of the mind and its capacity to resolve phenomena. There's all kinds of elaborate descriptions. You can read chapter 30 of MCTB and my book for my take on this. And it can happen in lots of contexts. And apparently there are at least 4 of the 500-ish people or so who have been in space who have reported these, which if we look at the ratio of 1 to 10, maybe there's 40.
Right.
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 So
and Dr. Edgar Mitchell reported like an overwhelming sense of unity.
yeah, so unit of experiences, sense of divine or cosmic consciousness, sense of interconnection with all things,
Yes.
magical powers opening, the sense of telepathy or telekinesis or ESP, or having knowledge that you couldn't have otherwise had, precognition, deep insights, radical changes in personality in the way of perceiving experience. Reality can appear much brighter. Bliss, rapture, all that stuff can come up. Some people will describe this as like orgasmic, or like, when you read the Christian mystics, some of them like describing these their sexual union with Christ and stuff. Like, you can get those kinds of overlays. And again, this is the twice born, if you've read William James. So people have had this the sort of second birth, the rebirth in the spirit, or the rebirth in this kind of different paradigm, different way of experiencing the world. All to me is kind of this general neighborhood territory category. And for a lot of people, that functionally is going to be what they think of their awakening. Now, from a technical Buddhist point of view, you would go on down the line and put it somewhere else. But for most people in this day and age, that to them is what they're going to mean by the word awakening. Right. So,
yeah. And also people interested in Dr. Edgar Mitchell, while he was on that mission, he also did an ESP test, and that kind of combined helped him, instigate the founding of IONS.
Yeah, it's not uncommon for people having peak experiences to all have the opening of psi abilities, to have first out of body experiences, to have the first ability to do interesting things, energy transmission, healing, knowing stuff, moving stuff, manipulating stuff, changing other people's energies. And there's a whole, and then like the whole guru transmission, like people who can get into that space, that's the realm of Shaktipat and
Darshan,
all of that stuff. Darshan, that's transmission. That's that same kind of band neighborhood of effects.
Yeah.
And it sounds like a pretty big lumping of categories together, but if you talk to enough people who describe these things often happening in some kind of cluster, temporarily on a retreat or in their ceremony or whatever it was, on their fasting, or just, I have a family who was just walking down the street and was the meditator,
not to be too UFO centric, but people watching this are most definitely going to be interested in UFOs. But a lot of people report these same kind of things after a UFO encounter. As I mentioned before, Dr. X and many, many others. So I want to encourage people that the UFOs and UFO encounters are like just the first step, and you can go into a much broader and more in depth, and I think enriching, realm of information, some of which can be very practical or even validating if you are
People who
researching.
feel they have access to the Akashic records, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah,
From that
and
other information
spontaneous
point of view.
remote viewing,
Oh
precognitive
yeah.
dreams,
Yep.
or not even dreams. It's a precognitive event. It doesn't have to be a dream either.
Past life experience is also incredibly common in this territory that can really shift people's sense of who they were and what they were, right?
Yeah.
Because plenty of those previous lives might have been all kinds of fascinating things.
Yeah. And
so it seems to them. Yeah.
Right. There's so much here. There's a little more I wanted to get into, but I know we're running low on the clock here.
Sorry if I just went on and on, but it was
no, fantastic, Daniel. It's always a pleasure. I got to have you here for a long session next time. It was my fault for scheduling a 1 hour when I should have gone for like 3, 4, 5 hour, right? Whatever.
We can do it. I've done it before.
We have like a small mini retreat with Daniel here, right? He's gonna hit us with the darshan, the hardcore dharma, and eclecticism, right? If that's even a word. It's always a pleasure speaking to you, Daniel. I love having you on. I love hearing what you have to say and your wealth of knowledge and your ability to communicate this work, but also all the work that you're doing, and effectively creating change in the world out there. So for people listening, what are your current projects and where can people find this information? I will link it in the description, but for people listening and watching, where can they find this stuff and what are you doing?
So you can find the EPRC at theeprc@.org. So theeprc.org. That's the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium. And go to our white paper and you can read until your eyes bleed about our massive project for global systems change and all the steps and stages of that, including things about UAPs and security implications and all of that stuff for people interested in the defense industry, et cetera. And then Emergence Benefactors, ebenefactors.org is the charity that supports all of this. If you want to help support this kind of work and help the clinical mainstream suck vastly less at this and be better, much more, that would be great. Thank you. And other projects I'm working on, I'm launching a podcast, weirdly enough.
Oh, right. I saw that. Yeah.
I think it's going to be audio only, although I might do a few quick YouTube clips. I'm still debating the best media format. That's going to be called The Institute with Daniel M. Ingram. So
that's hopefully
awesome. You'll enjoy that. It's just gonna be me in a very different context, talking about different sides of myself that don't generally come out in any interviews, that I'm like, somehow this stuff should come out. So hopefully that will get out in the next week or two, depending on time. I'll launch the first episode. What else am I doing? Yeah, that's the big stuff. So if you're interested in those things, happy to hear from you. Reach out, say hello.
Yeah, and just you did mention you're doing a fire casino thing.
That's part of the EPRC. So we're doing a fire casino retreat, which is a research retreat. We're doing neurophenomenology with some people from various universities, Florida State University, Harvard, and FSU. And so that should be very interesting because that gets into super weird territory generally. And we're going to have EEGs and surveys and stuff. And I've published a bunch of articles recently that I've either been the co-author on or been the research subject for. So you can find a lot of those. If you look up Matthew Sackett, meditation research project at Harvard MGH, you can find those articles, 7 Tesla fMRI stuff and the cessation EEG papers. So published, I've got 5 or more papers and a bunch of research papers coming out to help lay the groundwork for a new, hopefully global medical specialty that will hopefully own this stuff and give it a vastly better treatment than it's gotten so far. It's an ambitious project, and any help with that, totally welcome. Please reach out, say hello. And if you know where the rest of the money comes for this comes from, like, this is not a cheap project to do. Global systems change actually does take cash. So if you know of any philanthropists who care about this stuff, please reach out. We're happy to hear from you.
Definitely. And again, thank you so much for coming on and spending your time with us, Daniel. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
It's been delightful. Take care, James. Bye.
Take care, Daniel.